We want to extend a special thank you to Billy Cobbett and Renee Oman and their colleagues at Cities Alliance for co-sponsoring this event. We were really happy to have the opportunity to take advantage of having them in Washington and take advantage of IDB Cities Week to highlight this work on secondary cities. We're really pleased to have this panel of such distinguished speakers today. We do have bios available out front there, so I won't go through lengthy introductions. But the research and the ideas that will be presented today, we think will make a significant contribution to the understanding of cities. And this is a particularly important moment with the recently adopted Sustainable Development Goal 11 on cities and the drafting of the new urban agenda, the outcome document that will be agreed upon at Habitat 3, which will serve as a roadmap to guide global urbanization for the next 20 years. So I know we're all looking forward to hearing more about how this work will inform and shape those global processes. So we have a very full program this morning, so we'll just go ahead and get started. First, we will hear from Brian Roberts, a presentation of his book that he has authored, Managing the Systems of Secondary Cities, and we will just go ahead and get started.
Good. Thank you very much for inviting me, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a little bit jet-lagged, as you know from my accent that I'm a long way from here. Live a long way from here, but I've just come from Colombo via Brisbane, Sydney, and here. So it's the middle of the night for me, but I'm quite used to these presentations. Thank you again, and I want to give just a brief overview of some aspects of the book that we produced, and while I'm the lead author, this is a book that has substantial contribution from a very large number of people, and I must acknowledge them and particularly acknowledge the City Alliance for giving me the opportunity to pull this together. It's been a good chance to have a look at issues dealing with secondary cities, and it's a neglected area of research. Most of our focus tends to be on major cities, problems with metropolitan cities, mega cities. So, without further ado, we'll proceed. Okay. When we think about secondary cities, traditionally we've looked at a hierarchical kind of structure. This goes back through theory over 100 years. The idea is that the primate cities, the secondary cities, are all determined by population structure. That's changing. We now have a new way of looking at cities, particularly in relation to their functions. And I'll give a good example of this. If we look at a city like Hyderabad, or we look at Bangalore, this is a second-level city or a secondary city in the context of India, but it's a global city in terms of the way it functions. Many other cities of the world have global functions, in fact are leaders, and they are secondary cities. So we need to look at a different kind of typology and thinking in the way that we address this issue of secondary cities. So these could be sub-metropolitan, second tier. Normally they'll have population something like about 10 to 50% of the size of the largest population centre in a country. What we're seeing is very significant differences emerging in secondary cities. If we look, for example, in the GDP, just looking at GDP per capita, we see severe distortions emerging. City of Jakarta, the GDP per capita is 2.8 times the national average GDP. And if you start to look at some of the more remote cities in Indonesia, for example, in Ambon, we're seeing a factor of 5. So there are substantial distortions, not only in productivity, but we're seeing substantial distortions in income. We're also seeing rising levels of Gini coefficients in some of these cities. So in the context of say, Brazil, for example, we have a 1.9 difference between national GDP figures and the GDP of the city. Now, GDP is only one means of measuring it. In fact, it's the poverty indicators that we need to really be concerned about, and the levels of informal sector employment, which can be as high as 70% plus in a number of these cities. What we've seen is that the densities of these cities are much lower, the concentration of infrastructure is much lower, and all of these factors are, and the level of competitiveness is much lower. So this means that a lot of these cities, particularly in the developing countries of the world, which are experiencing rapid urbanization, are experiencing very, very significant problems. Now, why we need to focus on it? Because we've put a strong focus on secondary cities developing better cities. There's a lot of things that every mayor will tell you, I've got to improve the competitiveness, the performance, the livability of the city. But what we've got to start looking at is the systems of cities, because all cities are linked. They're parts of supply chains, forward and backward linkages through various systems. So what we're also seeing this need for competition, enhancement of trade and investment. Some of the work that I'm doing for the Australian government now is starting to look at the concept of trade, measuring trade between cities. It's extremely difficult to get data on a city-to-city level trade. Now, we can get some merchandise data, but we cannot easily get services data. So the important thing is that there's a new concept being looked at within the Asia Pacific Corporation. This concept is the idea of free trade between cities, looking at what are the barriers of free trade between cities. You have an example of this in the US, which is the agreement that was set up between Mexico City and Chicago, in which they're focused on 9 different flows in terms of sectors. So increasingly we're now looking at this next level down, because free trade opens up opportunities. But where do the barriers occur? They occur at the city level, and particularly at the primary city, but then more, as we're seeing more and more, some of the restrictions that are occurring at the secondary city level. So what we're seeing is, traditionally we had the older system of hierarchy. Now we're seeing as a kind of a new system of cities, which is focusing on multiple clusters of activity. We see in the very large cities, high-level services, New York City, Tokyo, Hong Kong, etc. These are very high-level financial services. But as you get down, you get to more specialised kind of levels of cities. So the functionality is actually very important when we're looking at cities. So what we see in terms of this, this is just a simple example of some of the levels of specialisation activities related to clustering that are occurring in some of these cities. So you see Toulouse in France, which is the centre of the A300 Airbus. But there's a whole range of supply chains that are around, a network of supply chains around this. So when we look at, there's a system of cities behind the production of that aircraft. Look at Boeing's aircraft, exactly the same. You look at many of the other defence-related industries, exactly the same. So it's how cities link into this system of value chains, supply chains, that's very, very important. So, I'll just give you an example of some of these functional kinds of cities. The city of Wellington in New Zealand, little city, no more than 400,000. It's a global centre for the movie industry, because that's where Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, many other things. And on the back of that, the city and the government of New Zealand have built their tourism industry. So we're seeing this level of leveraging through many of the specialised activities occurring. Now, I'd indicated Toulouse, Nigeria, which is it's a political capital. This is a political capital. It's also a technological capital as well. And then we've got Cusco, Mendoza, famous for its wines. It's linked into a global system of wine. You've got the Australian wine industry linked into the Argentinian wine industry. this whole network of specialisation that's occurring at this secondary city level. Now, there are three basic typologies that appear to be emerging in the context of secondary cities. The first, which is the historic one, which is, say, a state capital or a fairly large population within a provincial or state government or a district area. The new one that, well, it's not new, but it's been known for some time, is this clustered secondary cities. This is what's occurring around the very large metropolitan cities. This is an example here around Bangkok. You'll see it around Jakarta, you'll see it around Lagos, you'll see it around many of the South American cities. So what's happening in these is that the population is spreading out into the peri-urban zone, most of it uncontrolled. And most of these areas have very poor quality service, very poor quality housing, and a lot of other issues associated with land disputes and everything else. So the management of the metropolitan in terms of these secondary cities within these large urban conurbations is proving very, very challenging indeed. And what we're now beginning to see is a new phenomenon called deindustrialization. Deindustrialization is where industries are moving out of the centre of the city to the periphery, and with them is bringing large numbers of population, particularly workers associated with factory. This is happening in Bangkok, it's happening in Dhaka, you can see it happening in Bangalore. This is just the phenomena, and as a result of that, we're beginning to see quite large sort of informal settlements spread out in these secondary cities on the periphery of the major ones. Now, the third one is the most interesting and is emerging very quickly. It's the concept of these corridor secondary cities. A good example of this is what is happening across the corridor of West Africa from Lagos to Abidjan. These cities are being connected, and there's a whole range of new enterprises starting to develop. If you want to think about the biggest one, it's the Mumbai to Delhi corridor, which is planned for 170 million people, 36 new cities and towns, and a complete connected structure looking at industry. It's one of the biggest corridor development projects. You see there are about 10 major corridors in Europe. You've got good examples of this, Highway 5 and State Highway 5 in the US, but the functionality along that corridor at the borders is proving to be quite substantial barriers to trade and investment. Just takes you a long time in terms of, and the transaction costs on these corridors are rising quite sharply. Now, I'm conscious of the time, I've only got another 5 minutes. Why we should really start to look at these is that the secondary cities is actually the linkage point between about 75% of the world's population that live in smaller cities and rural areas and the major cities. Now, if our secondary cities are not functioning properly, then our rural and smaller human settlements, urban settlements, are not functioning properly, and neither are the major cities functioning properly. So the secondary cities is a critical, pivotal, logistical hubs. And the efficiency, improving the efficiency is absolutely important in terms of supply chains, whether those supply chains be in resource-related products or whether they be through modern multimedia. So the other thing is that they are producing a smaller amount, and this is where this distortion is occurring, and how do we address this? How decentralisation policies have on the whole failed. They've been successful politically, but when you come to look at decentralisation in terms of investment and in terms of fiscal flows, etc., we see quite substantial problems are emerging in this that we need to address at a systems level, and then as my research is that I'm doing with Cities Alliance at the moment, at the city level, there's a lot of problems with the systems. I want to just very quickly skip into some policy directions. We've been looking at how we can formulate approaches to policy followed through by investment in secondary cities that can help lift the development of these economies and particularly make them more livable places. So one of the critical issues is this vertical and horizontal integration, particularly between government systems. In many countries, I just come from Sri Lanka, there are parallel systems. At the local government, there's a whole structure that is dealing with infrastructure and other services, and then there's a parallel structure which is central agency. This is very common in many countries. So one agency doesn't talk to the other, we have no information systems in terms of GIS and other data, so nobody knows what anybody else is doing, particularly at this level. And it really creates serious problems with the whole governance of the secondary cities, particularly within this sub-national level. Then we need to look at the focus on clusters, specialisation, the management of the peri-urban around these areas, and fundamentally the revenue base. I was in a city last week, population 150,000, total budget for the local government, $1 million, and the amount of money that was available for infrastructure, $400,000. Now, how do you create or build an economy when you've got such a low level of capital to work with? Now, this is really one of the fundamental issues, is how to increase the value returns, because in many cases, if you look at the value of property, it's extraordinarily high. And the tax, I was in one place a couple of months ago where the tax had not been reviewed for 30 years, tax base. So in fact, it was costing them more money to collect it than they had money available for dispensing. Now, the second one is the policies around these major cities. And this is going to be very, very challenging because of the institutional governance arrangements. We've talked about this. We have political differences between local governments. We have multiple levels. Look at the Manila Metropolitan Authority. It's just multiple levels, and in many cases they're not functioning. And it's not just developing cities that have got this problem. Believe you me, the city of Auckland in New Zealand got so fed up of the lack of cooperation that the government stepped in and amalgamated 5 cities and said, we've had enough. It's costing too much in transactions, different systems by different local governments. They just amalgamated it. Now, that's a pretty radical solution, and only in a country like New Zealand could probably do that. You certainly cannot do it in many other countries of the world. So we've got to look at ways of managing the peri-urban, making sure the corridors are protected. This is the biggest problem. When the development banks come in, it's costing them, particularly in land acquisitions, 50% of the land costs, 50% of the project costs at least, just to be able to put the infrastructure in the ground. So protecting the corridors is absolutely vital. Now, I'll just wrap up now, and the final one, which is the one that I think we've really got to start looking at. It's these corridors and what is driving under free trade agreements. What we see is that a lot of local governments don't understand the implications of free trade agreements, particularly in opening up trade and investment opportunities. And we have major obstacles, particularly within the planning system. For example, Vietnam, if I want to get approval for something in Da Nang, it's going to take me 18 months to 2 years to get the land use approval. And yet, under free trade agreements that are being worked out, we're supposed to be able to deal with that very, very quickly. So there are this multiplicity of issues that we have to deal with in order to open up along these corridors. And these corridors are developing very quickly. And the biggest one, which is one of the reasons that the new infrastructure bank was set up for Asia, is the corridor between Shanghai on the rail corridor, the Silk Rail corridor. And the reason they're opening up this is that we'll be able to get containers from Shanghai to Rotterdam in 10 days. What does that do for the current system with respect to the way that trade is flowing between different places? So why the Chinese are invested in this is a simple reason, is they can see enormous opportunities with the cities along the route to capitalise on resource flows into their economy. But at the same time, they're looking for opportunities for expanding industry production. So these corridors are really the new phenomena, and there's large numbers of secondary cities that are located along them. Some of them have been landlocked for years, that are going to be able to capture new opportunities through the new transport networks. So I'm just going to leave that there. I think there's going to be plenty of basis for discussion this morning. The book that we've got is available on the Cities Alliance website. It's now available in English and Spanish. Hopefully we'll get a French version one day. So it's there to basically present what a lot of the current thinking is on the nature of secondary cities. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I hope they've gained something from what I presented this morning. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Martine Solier from the Emerging and Sustainable Cities Initiative at the Inter-American Development Bank.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Martin Solier. I'm working for the Inter-American Development Bank. I'm in charge of the coordination of the implementation of the Emerging and Sustainable Cities Initiative in the South Cone. I'm based on Buenos Aires, working in 15 cities in Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and Bolivia. So, the Inter-American Development Bank launched this initiative mainly because of two processes we were seeing here in Latin America. First one is the urbanization. Latin America and the Caribbean will be the most urbanized region in the world in 2050. Now we have 81% of people living in urban areas, so it's really important right now. And what we've been seeing is that intermediate cities are growing in terms of population more than mega cities. So, taking this into account, we try to focus on how they are growing. And the first thing we were seeing is that there is a huge spatial fragmentation. That picture over there is from Caracas, Venezuela. And it's important to see how the people coming to the cities, to cities that are not prepared and that are not planned to have them there. And they are settled in informal situation in the slums that are living in front of the formal city. And this is a special fragmentation we have in a lot of cities in Latin America. And of course, there is an urban sprawl. Our cities are growing sparsely. And it's very important to think about how are we going to do to bring some public services over there. It's like it's not only that it's everything sparsely distributed in the city and especially in the suburbs. But it's also that there is a lot of issues about the field in Latin American cities that increase the cost of the provision of public services. And there is another process important, of course, in our region, and that is the climate change. We have 82% of people in Latin America and the Caribbean living in coastal areas and areas under the risk of flooding. That's a picture from La Plata in Argentina 2 years ago. So we decided to launch this initiative and to help those cities, intermediate cities, who are growing more than the national average in terms of population and economic aspects, to develop and to plan their city, to plan how are going to be the strategies they are going to take in order to achieve a vision of the city they have. We started in 5 cities, in 5 pilot cities in 2010, Trujillo in Peru, Santa Ana in El Salvador, Port Spain in Trinidad and Tobago, Goiânia in Brazil, and Montevideo in Uruguay. And from that pilot intervention, the first thing we learned was that it would be really important to have 3 baseline studies, to perform 3 baseline studies in each city we are. And those studies are the urban footprint, the greenhouse emission inventory, and vulnerability. After that, in 2012, the president of the bank, Luis Alberto Moreno, launched an initiative for the whole region. And the board of directors of the bank allow us to add to the initiative 1 city from each country member of the bank in Latin America. So that what happened was that after that, the interest of the countries in being part of the initiative was so huge that just 1 city will not be enough. So the board of directors allow us to develop an additional program in order to add more cities to the initiative, but funding by 3rd organizations or 3rd institutions. The first one of these, well, we have 55 cities now in the initiative under the 26 cities under the regular program and 29 cities under the additional program. So I was talking about the additional program, and there was the first additional program we took under implementation was with FINDETER in Colombia, the Financiera de Desarrollo Territorial. There is 10 cities right now in Colombia being part of the initiative. The second one was with Caixa Econômica in Brazil. We had 7 cities there. After that, with Manobras in Mexico, 5 cities are under implementation there. And after that, with the national government there in Chile and in Argentina, we're implementing another 10 cities in total. So this is the 5th year of the initiative. We are doing an assessment this year. We are going to see how it's going to develop after this year. The initiative is going to be a part of the formal structure of the bank, or it's going to be an initiative. There is a lot of things that we have learned in the middle. The initiative, well, we develop a methodology in each city in order to help them to plan their city. And this methodology is is based on 3 dimensions: the environmental and climate change aspects, the urban and social aspects, and the fiscal and governance aspect. And we learned with the implementation of the initiative during these 5 years that it's important to develop a 4th dimension and to develop the aspects of competitiveness. So we were talking before about the importance of cities these years. I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 11th goal, talks about the need to achieve economic stability, sustained economic growth, the promotion of social equity, and the protection of the environment, while enhancing gender equality, women's empowerment, and equal employment for all. We're trying to perform and to develop the initiative in each city, taking this into account, the multi-sectoral aspects of the urban development. The methodology is based on 2 main phases. The first one is in the preparation of an action plan, with a first stage of preparation, another one of analysis or diagnosis. Third, the prioritization of the main aspects to take into account for the development and the sustainability of the city, and then the elaboration of an action plan. After that, we have the execution phase, that we try to help the cities to get the funds to develop the pre-investment needs and the investment needs. And also we try to help to the development of a citizen monitoring system in each city we are working. A citizen monitoring system as como Vamos in Colombia or NOSA in Brazil. It's really important to empower the citizens about the execution of the action plans, and also to monitor the development of the city in terms of indicators, quantitative and qualitative. We have elaborated 30 action plans in our cities. You can find them at the Inter-American Development Bank webpage. It's www.iadb.org, and /cities. So we developed more than 50 strategic partnerships with donors from all over the world, development banks, academic institutions, and private sector. And for each dollar that the bank was financed and contribution to the development of the initiative, we leverage 2.25 additional dollars from our partners. One of the case studies we can see at the book is the Barranquilla Culture Factory, and was an outcome of our partnership with the Institutional Technological of Zurich. Well, I'm not going to get into this, but there is a lot of opportunities for the private sector to invest in Latin American cities we are working at. There's a lot of knowledge products also we are elaborating. And I would like to get into the execution phase. There is another case study you can find there at the book, who talks about the Campeche experience with the base sanitation, and it's another one who talks about the implementation with guerrilla architects in the urban space in Mar del Plata. We took the people from guerrilla architects and we sent them to Mar del Plata in Argentina in order to spend there 3 months working with the local government And we performed a very interesting intervention in an urban area, in a commercial area, there in Mar del Plata. It was like the interventions in Manhattan, you know about that. And it was really successful for a lot of aspects, that experience. So we performed that with Get Architects in other 4 cities of the initiative, in Asunción, in Jalapa, and in other 2 cities. We try to link the needs identified in each city to the loans that the bank has there. So we are trying to help the cities to find the funds. So conclusions. It is really important to develop the action plans with all the stakeholders, civil society, academia, local and national governments, and private sector. It is really important to seek for the sustainability of the city in each sector, not only in terms of environment, but also in terms of the provision of public services, urban aspects, institutional aspects, fiscal aspects. Emerging and sustainable cities have become a regional public good, and everyone is able to implement the methodology around Latin America and in the Caribbean region. While we have a solid and expanded platform and dissemination with important global position. It is important also for the relationship with the local governments. And the private sector participation is really important also. It's particularly important in the concept of the implementation of the new corporation, NewCo. It's a new area into the bank. And it is important to take these opportunities identified in each cities in order to foster that participation of the private sector in the financing of those opportunities. So the Emerging and Sustainable City has successfully incorporated the climate change vector in the sustainable urban planning. That is also an important thing we like to highlight. I don't have too much time, so I'm going to finish here, and thank you very much for your time.
Next, we'll hear from Shomi Lal, the lead urban economist at the World Bank.
Thanks very much, Professor Roberts, for that very interesting presentation. Let me see if I can plug my laptop.
You might help me. Other skills. Yeah, I think you should. Do you have an HDMI?
Do you think that would work?
I don't have an adapter down here. Give me a second, okay?
Well, we have to move back to the other laptop.
Should I just steal this flash drive?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want to just put on the flash drive? Yeah. Okay.
I never use PowerPoint, ever. Maybe? Can you go?
That works.
Have you got PowerPoint?
Yeah,
I never use it.
you don't? I think that's really smart.
Works every time. Works every time. Works every time. Never fails.
Do you know which one this goes in?
Okay.
No. Get our IT guy back.
Oh.
Well, we're just going to put on the flash drive on that, but can you plug the
Perfect. Sorry, thank you.
I'm gonna start doing, I'm gonna try the PowerPoint. I think that's really
I
smart.
haven't used it.
Really?
No. also allows me to adapt my speech depending on what's happening in the audience. Because sometimes I keep adapt.
Thank you very much, Professor Roberts, for that really interesting presentation, and to Billy and Cities Alliance for bringing this book to kind of fruition. I think the whole idea about secondary cities is of great importance to many of us working in development policy. For some time, I think there has been this debate that should we grow secondary cities at the expense of big cities? And I think what the book shows very clearly is that it's not a trade-off between big cities and intermediate cities. These are all part of an urban system. And if the whole urban system functions well, then we will be able to deliver growth and jobs and all the good things that cities can do. But if we have favoritism towards few cities at the expense of the whole distribution of cities consisting of secondary and small cities, then we have a problem. And this problem is not trivial, because when you look at the numbers, all the action of global wealth is taking place in cities. And whether you look at the top 600 that McKinsey calls the kind of the big leaders, the middleweights, and around the world, we have more than 50% of the population in cities. But if you just count the top 600 cities, which according to Professor Roberts' definition includes these secondary cities, you have over 54% of global wealth. We really need to think about getting this right. And we really need to think about getting this right is because there isn't a single country in the world that made it through middle incomes without urbanizing. And there isn't a single country in the world that moved from middle incomes to high incomes without really vibrant cities. So the stakes are really high. And that's why I think everyone here should really pay close attention to the book and some of the key messages here. So, you know, Professor Roberts, what a nice book, and it's really good that you brought this out. The main reason we see all these good things happening with cities is when you're rapidly urbanizing, you move people off the farm and you get them to more productive activities in cities. And here, Professor Roberts said, well, you know, the problem is that the world is deindustrializing. So what happened 50 years ago in the growth of China and the growth of Korea is not going to happen when you have countries like China, countries like Vietnam urbanize, and it's definitely not happening in Africa. So this is a huge issue on the role of different cities in structural transformation as the world moves away from producing products to specializing in tasks. So now you don't have one city making that full car. You have, as Professor Roberts in his presentation made, you have Boeing sourcing its inputs from 200 cities, and those themselves sourcing tasks from another 800 cities. But we just don't know how this evolving economic geography of tasks is taking place. But overall, what we see around the world, and here I put some graphs between urbanization and incomes, we see the systematic kind of development between economic growth and urbanization. And the paths that Korea took and China took are broadly being followed in East Asia, but probably not in Africa. So when you think about secondary cities, or you think about large cities, as an economist, I have to wonder, why is it they matter? And cities, when they work well, they do three things really well. First, they provide this incredible market for labor. So as our kids get skilled, they can go find jobs where the firm they need really wants them. If you're in London and you travel for 45 minutes, an average worker can access 2.5 million jobs. That's the power of a city, is to aggregate talent with demand. And that matching happens nowhere but in a well-functioning city. The second, if you got a good, well-functioning city, you have a large market for these specialized providers. So if I'm a fashion designer starting up in New York, I don't need to invest in lawyers in my own firm to do kind of the proprietary work. I don't need to have merchandisers. I can just go down the city and find these specialized service providers. And they have a reason to be there because there's such density of demand for people doing new startups. So it's, again, creating this large market for service providers, where it's insurance, finance, lawyers, and so on. And third, the thing about cities that really is amazing are these spillovers. All the learning from watching other people do things, the innovation from density, these kind of production externalities, that's what cities do well. But it's not that all cities do them equally well. And this is the fundamental issue the book takes up. So we, at the World Bank, we did the report on economic geography. It's about 9 years now, Billy, since we did the report. And I think we tried to reframe a lot of debates about it's really bad to be in a big city by saying that cities of different types in your urban portfolio do different things. If I'm a small town, I can get scale economies by having factories that kind of do vertical integration. If I'm a medium-sized city, I can think about clusters of small firms in related sectors that buy and sell to each other. They create demand in that way. And if I'm a metropolitan area, I get diversity. I have industrial diversity, I have cultural diversity, so I nurture ideas, I nurture innovation. As that innovation gets to a mature cycle, those activities would go probably to a city that does medium-sized activities. The thing that struck me in America is when you thought about industrial structure in the 1960s, large cities did manufacturing. Today, rural areas do manufacturing, and large cities do innovation. So it's, again, the life cycle of cities kind of link up to metropolitan areas, to medium-sized cities and small cities. So the debate, when we think about it, as raised in the book, is about the evolution of smaller towns and smaller cities. And there's a lot of economics literature that says that if you're a poor country, having few cities do a lot of things is really good, because you can't spread out your fiscal resources. You can't spread out your few trained planners and kind of decision makers. You don't have the money to spread infrastructure around. Yet, the history of the world tells us that when you're poor, you have the most political pressure to spread things around. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we should debate is, how does the economics of city development play up with the political economy of city development? Billy, your own country, South Africa, is a testament of that, right? I mean, at that point, they should be having metropolitan growth, yet government is promoting spatially dispersed industrial centers. So I'm going to tell you about two parts in the world, and then I'm going to kind of conclude with some thoughts about the role for policy. So the one thing about Africa, over the last 20 years, you see that primacy, as defined by the number of people in the largest cities, is growing over time. Mm-hmm. It's not decreasing. People are coming to Dar es Salaam. People are going to Addis. And while there are lots of policies that are trying to spread growth around, economic and population concentration in the large cities keeps on growing. And the big reason for that is, I think, what Professor Roberts alluded to. What the small town should do is to do market aggregation functions. But what African cities are doing, the largest cities, are doing the same market aggregation function. So the mega cities of Africa behave like market towns. So there's a whole kind of disconnect in the way the urban system works. And this may be pretty normal for Africa. I don't know, but we haven't done the research. But given your big cities aren't firing, there's no way for the small cities to do their role. So that's something we need to think about. The other part of the world, if Africa was the least urbanized, the other part of the world that's the most urbanized is Latin America. And here, I think primacy, or the growth of big cities, is prevalent. And I think policymakers across Latin America think it's abnormal and something needs to be done about it. And if you look at graphs of the share of people living in secondary cities in countries like Peru and Chile, it's non-existent. So it's either people living in the largest city or living in really small cities. But all the productivity gains that you think about, doing things at scale, all these specialization economies from intermediate cities, doesn't exist. There could be a bigger story too, that Latin America's urbanization and economic development processes are completely disconnected. A lot of commodity-based development has no demand for secondary cities. But that's an issue policymakers are very concerned about. But just to be controversial, I looked at the growth costs of not having secondary cities in Latin America. If I were to take a standard growth model and look at growth concentration and economic concentration and GDP, clearly countries like Argentina, Chile, Peru are losing out because growth is concentrated in a few cities. But that begs the question, what should be done about it? And I don't think we really know. I don't think we really know because we don't really know what are the sources of market failures, whether it's the land market, the labor market. What are the sorts of coordination failures in provision of infrastructure and land use that are contributing to these kinds of development challenges? And the problem is that often government thinks they have all the information to predict where the market's going to go, but as in China, we know they often get it wrong. You have all these stories of ghost towns where billions of dollars have been put in with nobody home. So I think I want to conclude by this kind of argument that if we want to think about the growth of secondary cities, we really need to figure out the coordination failures that's at work. Why is it that we don't see secondary cities develop? Is it that the first big anchor firm doesn't want to leave the big city and go to the second city? Or is it we are just playing relocation games and giving fiscal incentives and infrastructure when labor and capital are immobile? I think unless we sort out those challenges, it'll be very difficult to say in a fiscally prudent manner that what sort of cities we should develop as a response to the big city problem. Second, let's assume that we figured it out. We figured out the city that's going to work. Then there's an economist I'd like you to remember. His name is Leontiev. And Leontiev said the world behaves in complements. So you can't do land and zoning and not do electricity. You can't do land, zoning, electricity and not do transport. You have to do everything at the same time. And that's a really hard problem because government departments we work with are not coordinated. And there's no economic reason why the Ministry of Housing should be physically or spatially coordinated with the Ministry of Transport. The spatial spread of what they do is very different. So kind of I leave you with some thoughts, figure out the coordination failure. If you figure it out, we need to think about institutions that build up capabilities to do coordination, but it's an incredibly tough thing to do. Thank you.
Very good.
And our last presentation, or next, is Melinda Laturi, Humanitarian Information Unit in U.S. Department of State.
Fabulous, really fabulous.
Hi. Thanks for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here and feel so honored to be part of this panel. I want to talk with you today about an important aspect of secondary cities. That's mapping places that, as we've learned today, are overlooked and under-examined. But first, let me just tell you where I'm situated within the State Department. I'm in the Office of the Geographer and Global Issues, and there are 4 teams in this office that essentially deal with a whole slew of different important global issues that have to do with multilateral transnational issues, the Geographic Info Unit that deals with international boundaries and map production, the War Crimes, Democracy, and Human Rights that deals with international war crimes tribunals, and then I'm in the Humanitarian Information Unit. And in this unit, I want to talk just a little bit about what we do there. The HIU has a number of signature initiatives. The first one being Imagery to the Crowd, which provides high-resolution imagery to partners after a disaster event so that this information can get to first responders and be able to help with solutions to a disaster event. Oftentimes, this is also facilitated through another activity called MapGive that the Humanitarian Information Unit also facilitates. And this is where remote collaborative mapping takes place to utilize high-resolution imagery and be able to create products that can be used on the ground in these situations that are often problematic. Another initiative that goes on are on-site and webinars that help to do local mapping and be able to validate and verify some of the remote mapping that's been done. And then all of these results are provided in an open source shared environment where the data can be posted and it can be accessed through such things as GeoNode and some other open source platforms. So I want to spend a little bit of time telling you about that because this structure and this basis has to do with the approach we'd like to take to how we understand secondary cities and how we might go about mapping them. Another aspect of the HIU is the development of infographics, and these infographics take geospatial data and analysis, and they produce timely infographics on critical issues. I think these are also some of the products that can come out of the activities that we're doing with secondary cities projects that we're working on. So I think we've heard a lot about what are secondary cities. I think we can agree with that. How many of you have been to a secondary city? Everybody, right? We must have had some association with a secondary city now that we've learned what they are. Certainly they have to do with rapid population growth. They have to do with urban centers of governance, logistics, and production. And there's something that has to do with understanding what's going on in these places. What I would argue, and I think what most people would agree with, is that we're really lacking geospatial data about these locations. We don't understand them in terms of their spatial structure, in terms of the extent that they occupy the landscape, and then how they are dependent upon all the areas around them for resources and goods to come to them, and to be able to serve that bridge position between the smaller cities and the larger cities that's just been so elegantly described by the other panelists. So I really like this series of slides, and I don't know if you visited this site or not, but it's put together all the urbanization data since like 1950 to 2015. On the bottom there's the site where this is. And so I just took a snapshot from 2014 to be able to show you the rise and extent of cities around the world. So you can see that you've got going from small cities, going to medium cities, going to large cities, and then coming to our mega cities. So I want us just to take a look at this for a minute because I think this exemplifies so many of the things that the panelists have been talking about. First of all, it shows the agglomeration of cities that create this continuum of cities across the landscape. It shows that different size cities can be formed over space and time, and that you have cities disappear, cities reappear, cities become part of other bigger cities, and so we have this continuum. What I think has been overlooked in the conversation today is really the role of the global hinterland to support these cities. These places that are not cities, that we're dependent upon resources to come from those locations to be able to support these cities. And so what's going on there in terms of another network analysis we must do to understand those sort of value chains that we've been discussing. So what kinds of data do we need for these cities, and what am I talking about? Well, some of the areas that we can think about are hazard maps that have to do with natural and technological disasters. If we want to do risk analysis, where we want to analyze uncertainty and do anticipatory planning. And then if we want to be thinking about vulnerability assessments for marginal populations, those people in these cities that are often invisible, overlooked, and how do we understand who they are, where they live, and what services they might need. So we know that we have lots of good global data, but we don't have very good regional or local information. And this is an area that we really need to be able to fill in this gap. We can do this through a number of tools, whether we're using open source tools, such as open source geographic information products, or whether we use industry-based products, such as tools such as a GIS software as ArcGIS. And then by doing this through creating new and innovative partnerships. And again, all the different projects that have been discussed here have this idea of innovative partnerships. What are they? Who do we partner with? Who do we get the best bang for our buck with in terms of who we start to partner with? So we also have opportunities to work with local communities that are changing up. The whole rise of citizen science, of crowdsourcing, these sorts of activities where we have new data collection, tools, where we're using mobile technologies, where we have increased connectivity across the world, where we can have better internet access in some of these secondary cities that for a while we did not have such good access to. And then all kinds of local activity, local mapping activities, where we're dealing with local communities and being able to engage them away so that they feel that they can have a vested interest and be able to really participate in the projects that are ongoing. So we can create a co-production of data for resilience, for human security, and for emergency preparedness as defined by these communities. So what is the Secondary Cities Project? What is HIU doing? We have launched a Secondary Cities Project where we're reaching out to a number of cities, working with the embassies around the world to be able to do a series of workshops and training in GIS that is a long-term investment with at least a year starting point that may go on for longer than that. So we looked at this to be an important way for building a local focus within a regional context for data generation for these important things that have to do with emergency management and urban sustainability. That we need to blend tools and technologies across the city and begin to build on the resources that are there on site. Important to this is data access and sharing and providing a suite of tools that are open source tools and open source results so we're able to share this. And then continued engagement for long-term, both locally on site and then through remote workshops that we can have. And we've coordinated with students at universities, partnering them with government officials and NGOs to begin to work on these various workshops, webinars, and training that we're offering. So our first pilot project, we chose Latin America, and so it was really nice to be able to be in this conversation and have it validated that that was a good choice because it is the most highly urbanized area in the world. So what a great place to start, along with the fact that many of these cities have issues that are important in terms of the high level of peri-urban development that's going on, lack of infrastructure, all the issues that are manifest in these areas. And we chose Cusco, Peru as our first location to begin our workshop process. It's a population of a little over 400,000, so I think it fits into the definition. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. How many of you have been there? It's a spectacular place. You should all go there. It has a huge historic preservation and tourism activity. It's prone to floods and landslides. It's a migration hub, and on top of that, it's rapidly changing. So all of these things are evident in Cusco. And so we partnered with, not only within our own government in terms of working with Embassy Lima and working with the Department of State here and our own teams here. Many of the team members are in the audience today. And with NGA for providing high-resolution imagery for some of the work we've done. And I'll explain that in just a moment. We partnered with universities there that provided the lab space and where we have set up for the training and long-term education plans for local capacity building. We partnered with the regional government who attended the workshop and was able to also learn the skills and tools that we were presenting to the group. And then also many of the ministries also came to the workshop as well, and we're very excited about this and we're very committed to supporting this effort. So we had a real strong partnership with the local, regional, and national government as well as our own federal government. And then looking at the various NGOs that also participated in facilitating the project. We had donations from industry in terms of ESRI that donated over $500,000 worth of software to the project. And we had a follow-up workshop that dovetailed very nicely with our workshop in terms of doing a map give activity and having people learn how to do this remote mapping process. Our workshop had 3 critical goals that we felt were very important. I should say 4. First one was learning spatial thinking, understanding how we think spatially and how important geography is for understanding how these cities are starting to grow. That we wanted to build geospatial skills and generate these robust data sets that could be available, again, through open source platforms. And then creating this data that people would be able to use for analysis long term. And we think that this process will empower local decision making. Is that the case? I think that's the assessment that we have to put in place to see what are the real results of this, and is this kind of activity making, in fact, a difference? We also want to build different ways for turning data, which are the raw numbers that we have generally, and converting that into information. So we go out in the field using a number of different mobile devices that are, again, open source and freely available. We teach how to do mapping and analysis. How do you go about actually collecting the data, putting it into a database that makes sense, and being able to conduct that analytical product, and then be able to do data management, where it is shared and how it is updated and metadata created for long-term use. We're also provided with high-resolution imagery, and so one of the first projects that we had the teams do was to do a change detection analysis using Landsat imagery. With that change detection analysis, that could point us to those areas that had developed the most rapidly over a period of time. We could find those peri-urban areas. We could look at those places where we could actually start to think about doing a systems analysis to be looking at how we might understand those, that spatial fragmentation that's going on, or look at the infrastructure and the extent of it, be able to map all this stuff and be able to really look to see what's going on in this particular location. So then if we can do this, that gives us guidelines for later on and how that might spill out into things like decision making, like urban planning, like some of the other issues in terms of understanding economic value chains that have been discussed here. And then how do we maintain this momentum? Well, we're first of all creating best practices that can be done across multiple cities for data sharing and project management. Again, the importance of open data for this using GeoNode or other types of results from projects that can be shared. And then year-round activity and follow-ups in terms of other remote mapping activities through MapGive, or accessing the materials we have posted on our website and developing additional webinars. So the outcomes of our projects as we move around the globe, and we have 3 other projects now planned with probably about 3 more in the offing that we're thinking about, is again this co-production of new data, working with local communities, partnerships for data and ongoing training where we have a local on-site university, in the most case, to be our local champion and to facilitate on-site continuation of practicing this. Building local capacity and using sustainable geospatial technologies, again, wanting this to be open source. And again, our support for geospatial data to transform emergency preparedness and development plans and really try and make a difference. This was our team that we worked with on site in Cuzco, and our team that's continuing to do activities. I want to just acknowledge them, the team in the room here that helped with bring this to fruition, and thank you very much.
Okay, our final speaker on the panel is Billy Cobbett, Director of Cities Alliance.
Thank you very much. First, on behalf of the Cities Alliance, it's a real pleasure to be back at the Woodrow Wilson and to co-host this event. I'm very grateful for the opportunity, and I'm sorry Blair isn't here to join us, but thank you, Alison, for stepping in. It's just over 2 years since we removed from Washington and Brussels, but it's wonderful to be able to come back and engage with the same practitioners and some new faces around these topics. So I don't have a PowerPoint, which I'm delighted by, as you've seen the technical problems. And I'm not going to focus only on secondary cities, but rather in the context of the adoption of SDG Goal 11 and all of the SDGs, try and think through some of the challenges that we will face collectively in implementing the goal of sustainable cities, which is not a new goal, but what is new is that for the first time is that we have global recognition of the importance of cities, both as objects of the need for assistance and indeed as players in their own right, and I think this is the important bit. And there's 2 parts to this equation. I was prompted by one of Shomik's comments because I'm going to focus really on the national and local environments that impact, but we also do need to think about, and we have been doing this in the Cities Alliance, is what does this mean for development agencies and partners in terms of how fit for purpose are they to actually engage with cities as independent actors? And I think the answer is it needs more detailed work, but the question is being asked. And reference was made to the complementarity of different services, how you can't do the one without the other. And this is absolutely the case at a city level. And so I mean, I've been, like many of you, I've been messing around in cities for over 3 decades. I have yet to come across anywhere in the world a city of any size where everything works perfectly and smoothly except water. That's what will be offered from the development agency. They'll come in with one sector and say, sorry, this year we're doing water. We've got a wash program or an energy program. That's what's on the offer. So generally speaking, where cities have a difficulty in one sector, they have it in multiple sectors. But that's not how the development agencies respond. And we're going to have to rethink technical assistance and support and lending to cities if this is going to become a new line of business. So in the context of the adoption of Sustainable Goal 11, and as we move forward to Habitat 3, I want to remind ourselves of 2 of the mantras that we have, and we would be as guilty as any agency of using this kind of evangelical language in making the case for cities. There's 2 things that we would have said in various forms over the last decade. One is drawing attention to the linkages between urbanization and growth. Linkages, not necessarily causality. And secondly, using the mantra, which is that cities are the drivers of economic growth. We've all heard it many times. And both of those are accurate, but with major, major conditions. There is nothing automatic about either. And in fact, urbanization can lead to the worsening of conditions in badly run cities. And a badly run city is not going to prosper and promote economic growth either for itself or for its citizens. And so what are the essential conditions that we need to address, we again collectively? I don't think this is the job of the development agencies except to think about their roles in this. And I want to focus on 3 baskets of challenges that I think need to be addressed as we move forward in responding to not only Goal 11, but the whole range of targets and goals across all 17, which may or may not be too many. The first, and I'm not going to surprise you, none of this is new. Don't look for magic. Look for the good old dull stuff of what makes development work and makes countries work and what makes cities work. Area number 1, what is the constitutional, legal, and fiscal policy framework within which those cities operate? Is there clarity between the tiers of government? Are the laws clear? Are responsibilities assigned accurately? Is there overlap between jurisdictions and functions? Is the fiscal transfer system stable, predictable, and usable? This is such a major question. It attracts not enough attention, and very few cities are going to be, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, to achieve what we're talking about in secondary cities, cities need power, authority, and agency to be able to do what makes sense for that city. In other words, we have to allow cities to respond differently to the same sets of challenges. And that's, I believe, where innovation really needs to come from. Most developmental frameworks, most constitutional, legal, and fiscal policy frameworks, number 1, are way better in the rhetoric than they are in the application. So most governments do have legislation for decentralization, but it is not applied, which allows Brian to say decentralization has largely failed and not be challenged. But the point is, the principle of subsidiarity, of having the right function, the right powers, and the right resources at the appropriate level, is an absolute precondition for achieving Sustainable Goal 11. And this requires a major amount of attention. The second basket of challenges is in the policy response of the city governments themselves. So very often local governments will present themselves as the victims of a bad policy environment, yet at the same time take a set of policy decisions at the local level, either by acts of omission or commission, and themselves exacerbate the problem. They very often, in all of our experience, most local governments do not focus on the whole city and all citizens at the same time. We have very particular picking out of working in certain parts of the city, but ignoring significant populations. And this is most obviously the case where you have massive informal growth, where the slums are not on the map and are not seen to be vital for the political future of that local authority to address. And so you have unplanned, unaddressed informal settlements. We have, in many cases, anti-poor policies, in effect, implemented, if not in name, in practice, by many local governments. A lack of appropriate planning, and in this, I would really include a lack of future planning. And some of the best work that we are supporting at this time in some parts of Africa is working with local governments to try and anticipate future population growth, most of which will, by the way, will be natural population growth rather than migration, which is as predictable and as certain as it can be. And to think about what your city will look like, not next year and not next election, but 2 or preferably 3 decades from now, and to start moving your administrative boundaries now so you can start planning for the services that will certainly be necessary. The alternative, of course, you saw in the photographs from ESRI, which is the retrofitting, which will dominate most city activities in Latin America for the foreseeable future. Africa has got an opportunity to do a combination of retrofitting and forward planning. But the default position of most cities is to act after the event, which of course is the most inefficient and most expensive way of doing city planning. But it has a long and proud history in urban planning throughout the world. So, and we have to also pick up on the point that as things stand at the moment under current policy directions, most growth in African cities, in South Asian cities, Southeast Asian, continues to be informal. Most development continues to be incremental. And our policy advice to governments in that regard is take that as your starting point and work with it rather than fight against it. And don't start planning from where you think you should be, but rather from where you are. But this is not a very popular approach. The third challenge that I would put on the table is, in my personal opinion, maybe the most difficult of all. And that is that even as we celebrate SDG Goal 11 and try and promote the role of cities to achieve this, most cities that we're talking about, and here I really do pay attention to the secondary cities, but this also includes megacities, have neither the resources nor the skills at this point in time to do what we claim they have to do. And unless we completely rethink our approach to the opportunities provided for working at local government, the need to professionalize the local civil service, and, to put it very clearly and provocatively, to turn working in local government a preferred choice of professionals and a career opportunity, unless we think like that, who's going to be running the cities that we are talking about? And we can all give you numbers of how many urban planners there are, not in that city, but in that country. We're just starting a long-term work program in Monrovia, Liberia, post-Ebola, and working with the mayor in the first instance for 5 years, just to try and rethink the city. There are 7 urban planners in Liberia, 4 of whom are in the private sector. This is actually not a bad proportion compared to other countries. But I'm making a general point. What skill capacity does the 5th biggest city in Burkina Faso have to run that city? Has anyone thought about it? How are we going to run these cities? We is very collective. Traditional approaches to capacity building and workshops, not going to cut it at all. We need, in my view, a 10 to 20 year major program of rethinking, first and foremost, what is taught at universities. So we are not teaching post-colonial master planning to cities that are doubling in size in 15 years. So unless we start looking at the human and resource capital that are going to be needed in hundreds of cities across Africa, in hundreds of cities across South and Southeast Asia, then our celebrations for SDG 11 may be more than a little premature. So it is good. If anything, the time frame between now and 2030 is far too short. We are talking about a multi-generational set of activities, but of constant activity, constant policy revision, starting now. But we have to be thinking about the big picture and the glacial or the glaciers that we need to move, because as excited as we get about the language, technology alone is not going to run these cities. It'll help, but we actually need an entire new civil service to run these cities. So I'll leave those thoughts with you at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for the excellent presentations. And now we do have time to open up to the floor for questions and comments. We'll ask that you speak into a microphone because we're webcasting the session. We'll take a couple, I think, since we have so many. Jessica, do you want to start right there in front of you?
My name is Heidi Smith. I'm a professor in econ in Mexico City, and I study municipal bonds and the bond market, the local level. My question is, you caught me off guard with the institutions and creating institutions, and how do you create institutions that are appropriate at the right administrative levels, right? So, I mean, we have this problem with fiscal decentralization. Oftentimes, it hits states, it hits small municipalities, but what about the mega cities that have multiple jurisdictions of municipalities hitting one another? And so what we're calling this is a type 2 problem. How do you address, I mean, one thing is addressing the institutional frameworks of multi-sectoral projects, but what about multi-governance issues within a territorial region that also have different types of necessities that maybe are not coordinated or have any incentive to coordinate, actually to fight one another?
That's good. We'll take these two questions and then we can work through.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentations. I'm Felicity Proctor, a consultant to RIMISP, which is the Latin America Center for Rural Development. I really would like to just focus a little bit on the SDG 11, sustainable cities, and the indicator underneath that on urban-rural linkages, and the SDG on regional inequality. I can remember the number of it. But the big question for me is, how do we start to bring a serious conversation between urban and rural sort of policy and strategy? We know that in small and intermediate cities, that many of the people who use those services have households that are based in nearby rural areas. And they're integrally linked in reciprocal relationships of goods and services, including environmental goods and services. And yet the conversation between, shall we say, urban planners and rural development practitioners is almost zero in terms of taking full advantage of the opportunities which those reciprocal relationships could bring. So I would really like to ask the Cities Alliance and the speakers here how they would like to see that conversation seriously taken forward as we've got this fantastic opportunity with the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
One more right here.
Well, I actually have the same question.
Okay.
I think that's taken care of.
Yeah, answer your question. Okay, well, let's go ahead and do a first round of comments.
WDR 2009 answer. Dominic, on urban rural.
Oh, should I start? Thank you. The first thing, Felicity, on this rural-urban linkages. I think too often we take the policy debate to be either the growth of rural areas versus urban areas. But we don't sufficiently focus on the links that happen from three channels. The first channel is commuting and the kind of off-farm labor market employment opportunities in cities. The second is diversification in the farm itself through greater urban demand, so trade and diversification. And the third is migration. And what we inadvertently do is often in policy making saying we should have growth in cities, but also have the coincidence of public services also in the cities. So if we can think about ways that we spread social services around, both in rural and urban areas, so the supply of water, sanitation, health, which are not subject to major scale economies, are put in all places, and the engines, whatever they are, of growth or job creation are focused where the markets would have them, and some of them off-farm would be in the cities. So I think if we can think about the broad typology to separate the geographies of growth from those of living standards and say we need to spatially equalize living standards but not growth, then I think we'll have much more of a fruitful discussion on building these sorts of linkages. And if I may venture to the first question, there's a very nice report done by the World Bank on Colombia. It's called the Colombia Urbanization Review that takes into account this idea about interjurisdictional coordination. And they review, I think, a lot of literature, but the point they come across, if you have externalities and spillovers in certain services, that's where coordination really makes sense and is effective, rather than just a lot of arrangements where you think about consolidating metropolitan areas into one government or trying other poolings, which tend to be less fruitful. So, but you could look at that, and it's a really nice book.
Just to, it's very early days to tell you how the SDGs are going to, address this. The process now begins in terms of the drafting of what's called the new urban agenda in the build-up to Quito, and urban-rural linkages, which is the language, is one of those policy tasks that have to be addressed. And more recently, I believe the Ford Foundation has brought out a very good publication on addressing these. Our view within the Cities Alliance has always been that and this is not to your question at all, because I very much agree with your question, there's a very stale dichotomy debate between, that it's a choice between urban and rural. And we have long posited again, it's a bit of a mantra that urban growth is actually good for reducing rural poverty. And it's making those linkages clear, which are a lot clearer in China than they are in other parts of the world, very, very clear. The focus for me, the breakthrough of the SDGs was in their universality. That this is not a northern agenda for the South, but it is all countries have to report on the same sets of goals and targets in terms of the SDGs. Which reminds me that I've just forgotten which point. It was leading up to a very good point, but I'll recover it and come back to you later.
About the coordination issue, I think it's not only between the public sector, the central public sector, the state's public sector, and the local governments, but it's also how can we manage when you have, for example, a utility of water supply. There has to be in the table. I mean, there has to be discussing what is happening with the city in that sector. So it's not only about the public sector and the different levels of public sector, but it's also about universities, about private sector, about everyone who is interested in the social civil society, everyone who is interested in the development of the city and in that sector in particular. We try to bring all of them, all the stakeholders to the table in order to discuss what is the best for the city.
My name is Kent Eaton, and I'm a fellow in the Latin America program here at the center and a political scientist at the University of California. And I had a question about political decentralization, which I think is one of the major trends that changes the way we think about secondary cities now as opposed to if we were having this conversation 2 or 3 decades ago. So in Latin America now, every mayor is elected directly at the local level. That was not the case before, where it was the military or democratically elected presidents who appointed that whole range of officials. So I think a really key question is how to think about variation in the behavior of what are now elected mayors governing these secondary cities. And I think we see tremendously exciting, innovative, creative mayors doing remarkable things, and disastrous mayors who are behaving in very anti-poor ways, and as some of you have indicated. So the question is really just, for those of you who study secondary cities, it would be very interesting to hear what your thoughts are in terms of what might explain this variation. What are some of the variables we should be looking at to try to better understand these successful mayors versus these disastrous mayors in secondary cities?
We have a question right across the way there.
Hi there, thank you. I'm Carrie Byron with Cityscope and the Washington Post. I just wanted to ask, just jumping off of Mr. Cobbett's fourth point on the kind of very daunting capacity building project that needs to take place. I was just wondering whether the New Urban Agenda process is a kind of feasible way to jumpstart that process in any way. Thank you.
Let's go ahead and take that one.
Ask me in 6 months' time, I'll tell you. It'll be one part of the process. I don't think it need wait at all. I'm hoping that we will kickstart this process inside the Cities Alliance, first of all by finding out who's done what, and not assuming that no one's worked on this before and that we're the first people that have thought of it. I think we will need a very clear audit of what capacity exists in different parts of the world, an assessment of something as mundane as terms and conditions of local government officials. You're not going to address it without addressing the fact that if you're very poorly paid. And of course, this is also an advocacy issue, because in most of the government, in most of the countries in which we work, local government is seen as an inferior form of government. If you're a player, you want to be at national government. If you're a medium good player, you want to be at state government. And if you're not much good at all, you end up at local government. That's a very often common assumption. And I've worked at national government and local government level. Local government's way more fun, but only if you've got the authority and the budget and the decision-making authority to do something with it. But if you're just an administrative arm of higher government, but you know, this issue of the capacity is just becoming more and more stark in our minds, and the traditional responses to it are just so projectized and so insufficient. You need to completely, what this goal is going to have to do is ask national governments, who are still the agencies of development, so this does not at all either exclude national governments as players nor as responsible agents, is for them to completely rethink not only their attitude to cities, but the economy. And that does go back to Shomek's point about, which is the intellectual location of this work, is to think of a system of cities, and to think of, and of course the linkages between the cities and the entire economy, including the rural areas. And the point I was going to make about the SDGs is that we are not trying to achieve, never mind sustainable development, spatially. You want to reduce poverty wherever the poor are. You want to grow the economy wherever. And the question is, what is the most effective way of doing it? And having a bifurcation, a developmental bifurcation, as between rural and development and urban development, is an absolute out-of-date and stale approach to development. And that is why, two reasons why the SDGs are significant. The first is the universality that I've already pointed to. And the second is that Goal 11 at one stage was in danger of being called urban development. And then it would have set up, where's the rural development goal? That's not the issue. The issue is, how do we make our cities work? And that's how we will interpret the goal. It's not how do we support only urban development, because by taking a city approach, you have to think about the markets for that city and supplying that city. And that takes you out of jurisdiction into functionality, which is part of the answer to Heidi's first question, which is you have this mismatch between administration and functionality, jurisdiction, and that's what causes so much of the problem in so many of the cities, if that makes sense.
I'll just make a comment about what makes a successful mayor. From my experience, is someone who has had an education in a developed economy, many cases, can speak English, thinks internationally, recognising that a lot of the decisions, the resources, are coming from outside their local area and from outside the national economy as a whole. So if I look at mayors, a place like Aceh, even I was talking to the mayor of Cuenca, very much aware of what is happening outside their immediate portfolio. And they're quite dynamic in terms of that. On the education, which is dear to my heart, we have an enormous problem. Again, I was in a city last week in Sri Lanka, one educated member of staff, one. Now, how do you run a city when you're expected to deal with a very complex set of issues, from infrastructure to finance to provision of social services, all of these things? We really have to focus some of our investment program, more of our investment program, in terms of our international investment through our development agencies, into capacity building at the local level. But I agree with Billy, without restructuring, without giving a living wage. And the first thing that Lee Kuan Yew, when he in Singapore did, was to create a living wage in the public sector. And the follow-up on that is countries like Malaysia now have focused on a living wage in the public sector. Indonesia is now focusing on a living wage in the public sector, not only at national, but also at the local government level. And some of my former students are now working in local government because they are getting a realistic wage. Otherwise, they're running a chicken farm, they're running a small business down the road, and the office actually becomes primarily their logistics centre, and that's what the government pay the telephone bill for. So the reality is that we've got some really, really substantial rethinking, and we've got to also think about the way that we educate, traditional ways of universities educating in even the course curricula. I can tell you, look at the garment industry in Bangladesh. We looked at the course curricula, it was 30 years out of date. Okay? That's in private sector. The planning school was teaching post-colonial as master planning, which is totally irrelevant for a city like Dhaka with 17 million, and then these smaller cities, the secondary cities. We need new sets of skills. We need skills that are dealing with disruptive technologies. Okay? You talk to disruptive technologies to mayors and other people, have no idea what we're talking about. And in this new wave of the third industrial revolution, which is emerging, none of this is understood, particularly in the way that technology and information. Some countries, and Billy and I admire Rwanda, which is rolling out broadband internet, very much understand this is the new infrastructure. This is the new oil that will run the secondary city economies. So these are key things that we need to think of in our aid program. But boy, shifting some of the aid agencies at times into understanding what's happening at the grassroots level is incredibly difficult. Getting urban as an agenda in any of the international agencies has been a real struggle until the last maybe 5 years, half decade.
Cities, Brian, cities.
Cities.
Yes, John Garrity, I used to work at HUD. To go up to the national government, and as the national government looks over the country, how central is the urban question in national development policy, or is it treated as simply another sector like power, roads? Has urbanization as a unifying element of the national development strategy gained any strength in the last several years?
Depends on the country.
It depends on the country. I come from Australia. We had a change of Prime Minister last week and the whole world changed. We set up a ministry for cities in the built environment. Absolutely remarkable. Because a Prime Minister who he owned a technology company, very deep understanding of impacts of climate change, all of these other factors in cities, decided that the role of the federal government was basically to have efficiently functioning cities in order to have a national economy that was functioning. So he understands systems of cities. But I can tell you, talking to heads of states in other countries, that's not the important issue, because these politicians are saying that, that this is a more of a local agenda. So it's different in different countries, and this is the real challenge of getting focused on having a national strategy, not just for cities, but it's linking economies. It's linking human capital skills. It's linking information systems. It's a holistic approach that we need to start drawing to the attention of those key policy, and it's got to start at the top in terms of setting the framework, because that's how all of the flows of transactions of money and other resources are determined, mostly under constitutional structures.
No, just talk.
I just would want to follow up on that and say that some of the most exciting things, initiatives that are happening are coming from cities themselves as opposed to coming from the national level. So thinking about cities as being at the forefront of trying to precipitate change and make things happen, I think is something we shouldn't overlook, along with coupling that with looking at the importance of education. I mean, we've said that over and over now, but certainly that has to be something where it doesn't just start at the university level. We need to think at the K-12 level as well and think about reaching out to the rural communities, to these other places where we can really have an inclusive curriculum that young people can understand that continuum and would then want to engage and invest to become employees of the city that they live in.
I don't know if, Marcia Goldberg, I'm working with the Association of American Geographers. Quick question on the SDGs. In looking at SDG 11, it seemed to me that most of the SDGs are linked to number 11, and that I'm really concerned that things will become stovepiped again, and that there is no sort of acknowledgement of the fact that the city function or cities are as central as they are. And in the sort of democratic process of everybody getting their interest area represented, you might be losing something from the fact that the integration of these things are more important. So I'm wondering, how do we prevent that from happening, which it frequently does?
Stovepiping in the United Nations? Are you serious? You point to a very real. In fact, we commissioned a study of all 17 SDGs and linked it back to SDG. The problem is most of these arguments and analyses start not on the basis of assessment, but they start on the assessment of turf, which is how good is this for my agency and my mandate and my funding. So wrong question, but that's normally how it starts. We turned it upside down and we analyzed all 17 SDGs, not to make the case for SDG 11, but to ask to what extent local government involvement in achieving the whole range of developmental targets was essential. And so we can share that analysis because there are areas where local government, in our view, has to be involved, and then should be, could be, and all the way down. But the snapshot was that our assessment was a total of about 65% of the entire system of SDGs will require local government involvement to some degree. So it is a key question, but it does also go back to previous question that John asked, which is who are the agencies and what is the view of governments? Because the reality is many of the governments that are rapidly urbanizing now, their parliaments are still structured along rural constituencies. And so it's very difficult to get rural parliamentarians to vote in favor of fixing the cities because it's very hard to sell. If you look at the governing council of UN Habitat, which is the agency that is mandated and will have to be involved in implementing the new urban agenda, the bulk of their ministries that sit on their board are the ministries of housing and often public works. So this is not city governance. And even though we call this thing the new urban agenda, it's a rather strange term because there was no old urban agenda. The habitat agenda to which we are referring was in fact a shelter agenda in the context of an urbanizing world. Very different from asking how cities are run. This was an element. And so there's a whole lot of sorting out, and government by government. If you go to India, the whole issue of urban development is split between two competing ministries. You've got the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, two separate ministries that do different things at a national level, and yet most of the functions are at state. Brazil has a Ministry of Cities. Australia has a new Ministry of Cities, but often the governments we're talking to, it can be local government and rural development are in charge of the cities. It's a mixed bag, is the polite way to answer that question.
Hi, I'm Jeff Schuman with USAID. And I want to ask a question, I don't know if it's a question yet, we'll see, about the issue of systems more generally. Because you can talk about a city as a system or a system of cities as we have today, but you can also talk about a health system or an ecosystem or food system. And then you can also, talk about the systems of institutions, the UN system, and you can talk about these things at different scales. And the advantage to speaking in terms of systems like of cities is that sectoral distinctions are less relevant, or to talk about a health system, maybe urban, rural distinctions become less relevant, but of course it becomes much more complicated to speak about these things. So I'm working towards a question, but I just wondered if you could talk a little bit perhaps about so at which level we can talk about systems more productively, and whether we're engaging with local or national governments or with sectoral specific issues, and if this is a useful way to talk about the SDG agenda as sort of a group of goals working together to make a better functioning system of development.
Ryan, you have the name professor in front of you.
It's rather like trying to explain nature, really. Look, it's very complex, but we know that all things are, all things are basically connected. So you've got to break it down into subsystems, such as we have a human body, but we have a nervous system, we have a circulatory system, etc. But it's all part of the whole, and each is interdependent. You've got to look at a system. If you're looking, for example, in cities, one of the things you would be looking at specifically is the logistics system around transport, for example, and looking at all aspects of that, the dimensions of that, to make it function more efficiently. And then you start to look at economic systems and cities. Well, it's about production, but it's also about having the right sets of skills that make that. So it's looking at the different aspects of supply chains, and this is where the ideas of urban morphology, I think, or urban metabolism are becoming very important in systems thinking, where we're looking at the stocks and flows. And this is the kind of direction that I think we have to take. What is the capital stock that we have in cities? How can we basically measure or quantify that? How can we look at the flows that occur, whether it's efficient or effective? And how do we look at the transformation process in terms of what it produces, a range of products and assets, etc.? So this is something that I think, in terms of intellectual thinking about managing cities, we're moving into that field, and indeed it's one of the things we're going to try some experimentation with in some research projects to see how we can start to measure this. And it's very difficult to measure quantities. You get into a whole array of things. There are qualitative things, and the problem we have in many developing countries, we don't have any information. We don't even have good statistics about population. So I think some kind of qualitative mapping tools using a range of techniques is the way that we can start to map out what we see as the perceived state of the environment in cities, and then work out, well, where we can go to improve it. And we've been doing some interesting work in India, well, I have with the ADB, on collaborative governance. Collaborative governance is really the new methodology of governance that we have to deal with. And the question in relation to multiple jurisdictions, that's one way of dealing with it. The other way of dealing with in cities is that we have to look at transcurrent, which is corridor development authorities associated with redevelopment. So where you get multiple jurisdictions of governments working together under a development authority. Now, Sydney is a city that's looking at this because it's got terrible problems of coordination. Terrible problems of coordination. Billions of dollars of investment needed to make it a more functioning city. So I won't take any more, but that's, I think, the way that we're beginning to think on this, and way we'll try to test out some new methodologies and techniques on this.
Okay.
Well, we just, unfortunately, we have run out of time and we need to wrap it up. I just want to remind everyone that the full report is on the Wilson Center website and the Spanish version as well. And I think we just want to have a few final remarks by Billy.
Well, just thank you. Let me greet Blair, having joined us. Thank you very much for your attention. A 2-hour session is quite long in the middle of the day, so thank you very much. Thanks to Brian, at least in public, for the very high quality work. This was not an easy knowledge gap that we had identified in the whole discourse around cities. And so I hope, whatever language you use, secondary and intermediate, this is a continual battle between some of us and our members. The issue is clear, which is that as the city agenda has risen on the global agenda itself, it has largely done so on the back of a focus on megacities and very large cities. And we thought it was vital to bring a correction and an addition to this debate, because by far the bulk of the urban challenge and where future growth is going to take place is in small and medium-sized cities whose names are not known and don't appear very regularly in the New York Times. And that's where we are either going to have a success or failure. Not absolutely, because the large cities are, of course, incredibly important, which does leave us always back to the system of cities in a national economy and understanding their linkages, and I think increasingly across borders. So on behalf of the Cities Alliance, thank you very much for your attention and for your continued support and engagement. The city agenda really does begin now globally, and it's time to re-engage with vigor. Thank you.